A time when a storm of blood and betrayal was gathering over the dusty plains. It's a tale of two brothers, one sworn to uphold the law, the other bound by an outlaw's code of honor. It's a story of a woman caught between them, and of a treasure that was cursed with the blood of every man who ever touched it. The train, a black, smoke-belching iron serpent, sliced through the vast, sun-baked landscape of the Texas Panhandle. It was an emblem of the New Age, a relentless, unstoppable force of progress that devoured the miles with a rhythmic, percussive roar. But inside one of its plush, velvet-lined passenger cars, the old, timeless forces of greed, ambition, and violence were coiled, ready to strike. Wyatt Kane sat by the window, his reflection a faint, ghostly image against the passing, endless plains. His face was a calm, unreadable mask, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were alive, missing nothing. He was a man in his early 30s, handsome in a hard, angular way that suggested both a sharp intellect and a capacity for cruelty. He wore the tailored suit and starched collar of a successful businessman, but it sat on his lean, powerful frame with the uncomfortable stiffness of a costume. Beneath the fine wool, his body was a weapon, honed by a life of hard riding and harder fights. His hands, resting lightly on his knee, were long and elegant, but they moved with the quiet, deadly grace of a predator. He was not a businessman. He was the leader of the infamous Black Creek Gang, a name spoken in hushed, fearful tones in every saloon and sheriff's office from Texas to the Arizona territories. They were not common thugs. They were a new breed of outlaw, a team of specialists who operated with the discipline of a cavalry unit and the strategic brilliance of a master chess player. Across from him sat the object of his intense, unwavering focus, a portly, sweating banker named Abernathy. The man was a picture of nervous anxiety, his jowls quivering, his eyes darting back and forth. He was clutching a locked, iron-strapped strongbox on his lap as if it were his own, beating hard. The strongbox, plain and unassuming, was the reason for this entire, elaborate performance. It contained $500,000 in freshly printed and traceable federal greenbacks, a payroll for the entire U.S. Army Western Command, and the key to Wyatt Kane's grand, audacious vision of the future. Wyatt's gang was not on the train. They were ghosts, shadows in the landscape, waiting for their moment. There was Silas, Wyatt's brutish but unswervingly loyal second-in-command, a mountain of a man who communicated primarily through grunts and acts of savage violence. There was Doc, a disgraced, alcoholic surgeon who had found a new, and far more explosive, calling as a master of dynamite and nitroglycerin. And there was Maria, La Serpiente, a woman of fierce, dangerous beauty who could ride like a Comanche, handle a knife with an artist's precision, and whose loyalty to Wyatt was a thing of obsessive, almost frightening, intensity. But the most important player in this dangerous game was not a member of Wyatt's crew. He was the one piece on the board that Wyatt both respected and despised in equal measure. He was Wyatt's own brother, U.S. Marshal Jedediah Kane. Jed was a legend, a living piece of frontier folklore. He was a man as straight and as unbending as the barrel of his own Colt, a lawman whose reputation for incorruptibility was as renowned as his skill with a gun. He was 2 years older than Wyatt, and the two brothers were a study in light and shadow, two sides of the same, tarnished coin. Where Wyatt was calculating, charming, and subtle, Jed was direct, laconic, and implacable. They had been raised on the same hard-scrabble ranch, had learned to ride and shoot together, their bond forged in the harsh and forgiving crucible of the Texas plains. But somewhere along the way, their paths had diverged, a fork in the trail that had sent one down the road of the law, the other down the path of the outlaw, turning them into the opposing poles of the frontier's moral compass. This job was not just about the money for Wyatt. The money was a means to an end, the capital for an empire he planned to build in Mexico. But the true prize, the real, emotional core of this audacious robbery, was his brother. Jed, the great, incorruptible lawman, was the personal escort for this payroll. He was in the forward car, a solitary, watchful guardian, a symbol of the very law and order Wyatt so profoundly disdained. To rob this train, under his brother's very nose, would be to not just make himself rich beyond his wildest dreams, it would be to defeat his brother in the most public and most humiliating way possible. It would be to prove, once and for all, that his own cynical, and predatory philosophy was the one that truly ruled this land. The train began to slow, its steam whistle letting out a long, mournful cry that seemed to echo the lonely emptiness of the surrounding plains. They were approaching the Red Rock Trestle, a massive, skeletal bridge of timber and iron that spanned a deep, 100-foot canyon. It was a marvel of modern engineering. It was also a perfect, pre-designated point of ambush. Wyatt stood, his movements calm and unhurried in the suddenly quiet car. He straightened his tie. He gave a polite, almost apologetic, nod to the sweating, terrified banker. And then, with a movement that was as smooth and as final as a striking snake, he drew the small, pearl-handled derringer that was hidden in his waistcoat. At the same instant, at the front of the train, the world exploded. A massive dynamite charge, planted by Doc with a surgeon's precision at the far end of the trestle, detonated with a deafening, earth-shaking roar. The iron rails of the track, the very symbol of the new, inexorable order, twisted and curled like licorice sticks, a mangled, impassable barrier. The iron serpent was trapped, its spine broken. And from the high, rocky walls on both sides of the canyon, the Black Creek gang rose, their rifles and shotguns opening up in a disciplined, devastating volley. They did not fire at the passenger cars. Their target was the small contingent of soldiers who were riding guard on a flatbed car at the front, a professional, brutal, and utterly overwhelming fusillade of lead. Inside the passenger car, Wyatt fired his derringer. Not at the banker, but at the window, shattering the glass. It was the signal. He grabbed the strongbox from the now sobbing, terrified Abernathy, the man's resistance as flimsy as his own shattered nerves. A second later, a rope snaked down from the roof of the car, and Maria appeared in the shattered window. She was a lithe, powerful figure, her face flushed with the exhilaration of the fight, a wild, triumphant grin on her face. She took the strongbox, and with a strength that was shocking in a woman of her size, she hauled it up and out. Wyatt did not follow. His part in this act was not yet over. He calmly holstered his derringer, straightened his suit coat, and walked to the end of the car. He stepped out onto the platform, into the heart of the chaos, into the acrid, swirling smoke of the gunfight. He saw his brother, Jed, a tall, defiant figure, using the massive, iron engine as cover, his twin Colts barking a steady, measured, and deadly answer to the ambushers' fire. He was magnificent. He was a force of nature, a one-man army against impossible odds, the very embodiment of the law and order that Wyatt so despised. Wyatt did not draw his own gun. He simply stood there, on the platform, a calm, well-dressed man in the heart of a hurricane, a connoisseur of violence, and he watched his brother fight. This was his masterpiece, his great, bloody, and very personal work of art. And he wanted to have a front row seat to watch his brother, the great Jedediah Kane, the man who had always been the better man, the better son, the better everything, finally, and irrevocably fail. U.S. Marshal Jedediah Kane was a man who understood the brutal, chaotic calculus of a gunfight better than any man alive. He knew, in the first, deafening, gut-wrenching second of the explosion, that this was not a random robbery by a band of desperate, half-cocked thugs. The precision of the blast, the immediate, overwhelming, and disciplined nature of the ensuing fusillade. This was a professional job. It was a military-style ambush, planned with a cold, strategic brilliance that was as rare as it was deadly. And he knew, with a cold, sickening certainty that settled in the pit of his stomach like a lead weight, that there was only one man in the territory who possessed that particular, twisted brand of genius. His brother. He didn't waste a precious second on shock or anger. Those were luxuries for the men who were about to die. He reacted. As the first volley of fire from the canyon walls ripped through the ranks of the small, 10-man army escort, turning their flatbed car into a slaughterhouse, he was already moving. Diving from the relative exposure of the engine cab to the solid, iron cover of the massive boiler, his twin Colt peacemakers seeming to leap into his hands as if they were a part of his own body. He was not just a gunfighter, he was a commander, and the instinct to lead was as ingrained in him as the instinct to breathe. "Take cover," he roared at the surviving, terrified soldiers, his voice a deep, authoritative boom that cut through the cacophony of the gunfight. "Return fire. The rocks. Pin them down." But he knew, with a cold, grim finality, that it was a hopeless fight. His men were soldiers, brave and disciplined, but they were trained for the open field battles of the recent war, for lines and formations. They were not trained for this kind of close-quarters ambush against an unseen, well-positioned, and utterly ruthless enemy. They were being cut to pieces, their return fire sporadic, panicked, and tragically ineffective. Jed fought with a cold, detached, and righteous fury. He did not fire wildly into the rocks. That was a fool's game, a waste of precious ammunition. He was a master of the patient, deadly art of the gunfight. He would wait, his body a coiled spring of potential energy, for a muzzle flash from the rocks, a puff of gun smoke, the brief, fleeting exposure of a foolhardy head. And then, his own Colt would bark, a single, sharp, and final report, his bullet seeking its target with an unerring, deadly accuracy. He was a force of nature, a one-man bastion of the law against a tide of chaos and death. But for every one of the ambushers he pinned down or took out, two more would open up from a different position. They were a coordinated, disciplined team. They were his brother's men, and they were winning. It was then that he saw him, Wyatt, standing on the platform of the passenger car, a calm, immaculately dressed spectator at his own personal war. He was not fighting. He was watching. He was observing the battle as a general would, or as a man would watch a particularly interesting hand of poker. And in that moment, all of Jed's cold, professional detachment was burned away by a hot, white flash of pure, fraternal rage. This was not just a robbery. This was a message, a challenge, a duel of wills, of philosophies, of two brothers who had been on a collision course since the day they had been born. He saw the rope snake down from the roof of the car. He saw the woman, a lithe, dark-haired figure of shocking, athletic grace, take the strongbox. He saw the prize, the $500,000 in federal currency, the very thing he had sworn on his badge and his honor to protect, being stolen from under his very nose. He knew he could not win this fight. Not here. Not like this. To stay and fight would be to die, a futile, empty gesture of a man who valued his pride more than his life. And Jedediah Kane was not a prideful man. He was a practical one. His duty was not to die for the gold. His duty was to bring the men who had stolen it to justice. His duty was to hunt down his own brother. He made his choice. It was a choice that went against every fiber of his being, against his own rigid and unbending code of honor. He chose to retreat. He chose to live to fight another day. Fall back, he bellowed at the two surviving, terrified soldiers who were still pinned down behind the bullet-riddled water tender. To the rear cars. Get the passengers down on the floor. Now. He laid down a blistering field of covering fire, his two Colts a continuous, rolling thunder, his hands moving with a speed and a precision that was a thing of terrible, deadly beauty. He forced the ambushers to keep their heads down, to seek the safety of their rock and earth fortifications. He moved from the cover of the engine to the baggage car, then from car to car, a grim, determined guardian angel, shepherding the handful of survivors to soldiers and the train's engineer and fireman towards the relative safety of the rear of the train. From the platform, Wyatt watched him go, a slow, cold, and utterly triumphant smile touching his lips. He had won. He had not just stolen the money, he had broken his brother. He had forced the great, unbending, and ferociously heroic Jedediah Kane to turn his back, to retreat, to admit defeat. As Jed reached the final car, the caboose, he saw Wyatt, still standing on the platform, raise a hand in a final, mocking salute. Then, Wyatt calmly, and with a shocking, athletic grace, leaped from the platform and slid down a rope that had been thrown to him from the canyon floor below, disappearing into the rocks like a phantom. The gunfight was over. A profound, ringing silence fell over the canyon, a silence that was even more shocking than the noise it had replaced. It was broken only by the groans of the wounded, the soft, hissing whisper of steam from the crippled engine, and the lonely, mournful cry of a distant hawk. Jed stood on the back of the caboose, his gun smoking, his face a grim, stony mask. He looked out at the scene of the massacre. 6 of his soldiers were dead. The payroll was gone. And his brother, his own flesh and blood, was the architect of it all. He was not just a lawman anymore. He was a hunter. He was an avenger. And he knew, with an absolute, unshakable certainty, that his trail, and his brother's, had now, finally, and irrevocably, merged. There would be no more running. There would be no more turning back. There would only be a final, bloody reckoning, somewhere out there, in the vast, and forgiving, and now very personal, wilderness of the West. The town of Redemption was a 2-day hard ride from the site of the Red Rock Trestle Massacre, and it was to this small, dusty island of civilization that Jedediah Kane brought his wounded and his dead. The town, which had only recently buried its own dark and violent past, now found itself the unwilling epicenter of a new, and far more epic, conflict. The arrival of the grim, bloody procession through wounded soldiers, the 6 bodies wrapped in canvas, and the tall, grim-faced U.S. Marshal sent a shockwave through the quiet, respectable community. At the heart of Redemption, and at the heart of the storm that was brewing between the Kane brothers, was a woman named Maria. She ran the town's only hotel and cantina, a place of quiet, respectable order, its adobe walls cool and welcoming, its floors scrubbed clean, its windows adorned with pots of bright red geraniums. She was a woman of striking, serene beauty, with hair as black as a desert night and eyes that held a deep, quiet wisdom. She moved with a dignified grace that commanded a respect that had nothing to do with fear. She was also the woman who was loved, in their own, starkly different ways, by both of the Kane brothers. She had known them since they were boys, since the days when they were just 2 inseparable, rough-and-tumble kids from a poor, struggling ranch. She had been the beautiful, almost mythical, and seemingly unattainable daughter of the wealthy Mexican landowner whose sprawling hacienda had bordered their own, hard-scrabble property. She had been their friend, their confidant, the object of their shared, boyish affections. She had watched them grow, had seen the seeds of the men they would become. She had seen Jed's fierce, and bending, and sometimes infuriatingly rigid, sense of right and wrong. And she had seen Wyatt's restless, brilliant, charming, and dangerously ambitious mind. She had loved them both, a truth she had rarely admitted even to herself. But it was Jed, the steady, honorable, and predictable one, that she had chosen. They had been engaged to be married 15 years ago. A small, simple, and very happy future had been laid out before them. And then the war had come, the great, bloody conflict between the states, and it had changed everything. It had taken the 2 young, inseparable brothers and had sent them down 2 starkly different, and ultimately irreconcilable, paths. Jed had come back a hero, a decorated Union officer, a man who had seen the chaos of the world and had dedicated his life to imposing order on it. He had come back a lawman. Wyatt had come back something else. A man who had seen the same chaos and had decided to master it, to bend it to his own formidable will. He had come back an outlaw. And the wedding, and the quiet, simple future, had never happened. Maria had been left in the middle, a casualty of their own, personal, and undeclared war. Now, that war had come to her doorstep. Jed arrived with the grim, bloody procession from the train, his face a mask of cold, hard fury that she had not seen since the days of his youth. He did not come to her as a lover, as a friend. He came to her as a U.S. Marshal, his voice a flat, official monotone, requisitioning her hotel for his wounded, her storeroom for his dead. He was a man possessed, a creature of pure, single-minded purpose. He was gathering a posse, a federal posse, with the authority to ride anywhere, to do anything, to bring his brother to justice. "I will hunt him to the ends of the earth, Maria," he said to her, in a quiet, stolen moment in the hotel lobby, the sounds of the town's grim, excited preparations for war abuzz around them. His voice was a low, chilling whisper, his eyes holding a fire she had not seen in a decade. "I will not rest until he is either in a cell or in a grave." That night, as the town of Redemption was transformed into a veritable military encampment, and a guest arrived at Maria's hotel, he did not ride into town on the main street, a grand, arrogant entrance. He came in from the desert, a silent, ghost-like figure in the moonlight, his horse's hooves making no sound on the soft, dusty ground. It was Wyatt. He did not come as a swaggering, triumphant outlaw. He came to her back door, a quiet, almost hesitant knock. When she opened it, she saw not the confident, arrogant mastermind of the robbery, but the ghost of the boy she had once known, his stormy eyes filled with a strange, aching vulnerability. "I had to see you, Maria," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. She let him in, her heart a battlefield of 1,000 conflicting emotions. Love, anger, fear, and a deep, profound, and abiding sorrow for the two boys who had been lost, and the two hard men who had taken their place. She led him to her private sitting room, a place of quiet, civilized grace, a small, fragile island of her own, old world in the heart of this new, brutal one. "You are a fool, Wyatt," she said, her voice a low, angry whisper, her hands clenched at her sides. "A magnificent, brilliant, and damned fool. What have you done?" "I have done what I had to do," he replied, his gaze intense and wavering, moving around the room, taking in the books, the spinet, the small, silver-framed daguerreotype of her parents. "I have taken what this world was not willing to give me. I have become the man I was always meant to be." He had not come for absolution. He had not come to explain. He had come for her. He told her of his plan. He had the money. He could disappear. He could go to California, to South America, start a new life, a new empire. He was a king, and he was offering her a crown. "Come with me, Maria," he pleaded, his voice a low, seductive whisper, his hand reaching for hers. "Leave this dusty, dead-end town. Leave him. He is a man who loves the law, who loves his own rigid code of honor, more than he could ever love a woman. He is a ghost, a monument to a past that is dead and gone. I can give you a life of passion, of power, a life of a queen." He was the serpent in her garden, his words a poison of temptation, of a life she had sometimes, in her loneliest, most desperate moments, dreamed of. A life beyond the dust, beyond the silence, beyond the endless, patient waiting. She looked at him, at his handsome, dangerous face, at the brilliant, restless fire in his eyes, and she was tempted. But then she thought of Jed. She thought of his quiet, steady, and unwavering honor. She thought of the look in his eyes when he had spoken of his brother, a look not just of rage, but of a deep, profound, and soul-crushing pain. The look of a man who has been forced to hunt a piece of his own soul. "No, Wyatt," she said, her voice a soft, final whisper, pulling her hand away. "I cannot. My place is here." Wyatt's face hardened, the vulnerability gone in an instant, replaced by the cold, calculating mask of the outlaw. "Then you have made your choice," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He stood and walked to the door. "But know this, Maria. When this is over, when he has hunted me down, there will be only one of us left standing, and you will be the widow of a king. The only question is, which one?" He was gone, melting back into the desert night, leaving her alone with his words, a prophecy of the coming, fratricidal storm. She was the woman in the middle, the prize in a war she had not asked for, a war that she knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, would end in a grave, in the dust of the town that had once been her sanctuary, and had now become the battlefield for the souls of the two men she had loved. Wyatt Kane did not ride far from redemption. To do so would have been the act of a common, panicked thief. And Wyatt was not common. He was a grand strategist, a master of the calculated risk, and his presence so close to his brother's new base of operations was the most audacious risk of all. He and his gang made their camp in a hidden, labyrinthine network of canyons in the Badlands a day's ride east of the town, a place the old-timers called the Devil's Backbone. It was a natural fortress, a place of twisting passages and high defensible ridges, a place that Jed knew as well as he did. This was not a retreat. It was an invitation, a challenge, a chessboard, set and waiting. The Black Creek Gang was not a collection of common thugs who followed a leader out of fear. They were a family, a pack, bound together by a fierce, and often brutal, loyalty to their alpha, Wyatt. They believed in his vision, in his brilliance. But the robbery, for all its spectacular success, had left a small, hairline fracture in their unity. And Wyatt's secret, nocturnal visit to redemption was about to turn that fracture into a gaping, fatal chasm. The source of the fracture was the woman, Maria. Silas, Wyatt's brutish, simple, and utterly loyal second-in-command, did not understand his leader's obsession. To him, the world was a simple, straightforward place of violence and reward. They had the reward. Why were they not enjoying it? "We have the money, boss," he grumbled, as they sat around a small, smokeless fire, the high canyon walls a dark, oppressive presence around them. We should be halfway to Mexico by now, drinking tequila and spending our winnings. Why are we sitting here, in your brother's backyard, waiting for him to come for us? Because, my dear, simple Silas, Wyatt replied, a cold, mocking amusement in his voice, as he cleaned his custom-made Remington revolver, its silver inlay glinting in the firelight. This is not finished. A job is not finished until all the loose ends are tied. And my brother is a very, very large loose end. It is not just about the money. It is about a final and complete victory. But it was Maria, La Serpiente, who was the true and most dangerous dissenter. She was a woman of fierce passions and even fiercer loyalties. She had followed Wyatt out of a mixture of a genuine, if twisted, love for the man and a deep, biting belief in his vision of a new kind of outlaw empire. But she was not a fool. She had seen the look in Wyatt's eyes when he had returned from his secret visit to redemption. It was not the look of a victorious general. It was the look of a spurned and very dangerous lover. This is about her, isn't it? She said to him later, in the privacy of his tent, her voice a low, dangerous hiss, like the snake she was named for. The hotel keeper. The ghost from your past. You are risking all of this, all of our lives, for a woman who chose your brother over you, 15 years ago. This is not about her, Wyatt lied, his voice a smooth, silken thing that did not quite cover the hard, angry edge beneath. This is about strategy. Jedediah will expect us to run. He will ride south, towards the border. His whole posse will be a lumbering, slow-moving beast. But we are here, behind him. We will be the hunters, and he will be the hunted. We will pick his posse apart, one by one, until it is just him, alone. She did not believe him. She was a woman, and she knew the landscape of a man's heart as well as she knew the canyons of the desert. She knew that this was no longer a strategic war for money. It had become a personal, emotional, and very foolish war for a woman. The Outlaws' code, thin written, but sacred, set of rules that governed their violent, precarious world, was beginning to break down. The code was simple. You were loyal to the gang, you were loyal to the leader, and you did not let personal matters, especially matters of the heart, interfere with the business. Wyatt was breaking that code, and the cracks in the foundation of his small, outlaw empire were beginning to show. The first, tangible sign of the coming conflict came in the form of a lone rider who approached their camp under a white flag of truce. It was the young, earnest Sheriff Brody, from Redemption, his face pale but his eyes filled with a new, hard-won determination. He was brought before Wyatt, and he stood his ground, a small, defiant figure of the law in a den of wolves. I have a message, he said, his voice a little shaky, but clear. From Marshal Kane. Wyatt smiled, a slow, cold, and confident expression. He was enjoying this, the theater of it all. Does my brother wish to surrender? He offers you a choice, Brody replied, ignoring the jibe. Return the gold, and surrender yourself and your men, and he will see that you are given a fair trial. No one else has to die. Wyatt threw his head back and laughed, a genuine, and genuinely chilling, sound that echoed off the high canyon walls. A fair trial, he said. He looked around at the hard, cynical faces of his men. Tell my brother, tell the good and honorable Marshal Jedediah Kane that I will see him in hell before I see him in a courtroom. He then turned his cold, amused gaze back to the young sheriff. And as for his messenger, I believe in a different kind of justice. The kind that sends a clear and unambiguous response. Before Brody could react, Silas had backhanded him across the face, and he was dragged away a prisoner, his flag of truce a trampled, meaningless piece of cloth in the dust. The taking of a messenger under a flag of truce was a profound and deeply dishonorable violation of the Outlaws' code. It was a sign of a man who was no longer thinking rationally, a man who was being driven by his emotions, by his pride. It was a sign of weakness. Maria watched, her face a mask of cold fury. She saw not a strong leader making a bold, decisive move, but a weak man, a spurned man, lashing out like a petulant child. She saw a man who was willing to risk everything, to break every rule, for a personal vendetta. She saw a man who was no longer a brilliant strategist, but a liability. That night, as the camp was asleep, she made her own choice. She was a serpent, and the first law of the serpent is to survive. She went to the small cave where Sheriff Brody was being held, a silent, dark-clad figure in the night. She cut his bonds. "Go," she whispered, pressing a canteen of water and a knife into his hands. "There is a game trail on the North Ridge. It will lead you out of these canyons. Be a ghost. Do not be seen." She paused, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "And you will give a message to the great Marshal Kane. You will tell him that his brother is a fool. And you will tell him that the Devil's Backbone is a place of many, many hidden passages. And that a serpent knows them all." She was not just freeing a prisoner. She was sending a message. A message of betrayal. She was choosing a side. And in the complex, bloody, and deeply personal war between the Kane brothers, she had just become the most dangerous, and the most unpredictable, of all the players. Sheriff Brody's return to redemption was a testament to his own newfound grit and the surprising, if treacherous, mercy of a woman he had thought was his enemy. He stumbled into town at dawn, his clothes torn, his face bruised, his body aching with a deep, profound exhaustion, but his eyes blazing with a new, hard-won fire. He had survived the Devil's Backbone, and he had come back with a treasure far more valuable than gold: intelligence. He went directly to the hotel, to the small, commandeered room that was now Jedediah Kane's field office. Jed was there, a solitary, brooding figure, staring at a map that was spread out on the table, a map of the territory, a map of his brother's soul. Brody told him everything. He spoke of the hidden camp, of the gang's surprisingly low morale, of Wyatt's arrogant, and ultimately foolish, refusal of the truce. And he spoke of the woman, Maria, La Serpiente, and her cryptic, final message: the Devil's Backbone is a place of many, many hidden passages. And a serpent knows them all. Jedediah Kane listened, his face a mask of stone, but inside, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. He was a lawman, a man who saw the world in the stark, simple colors of black and white, of right and wrong, of the law and the lawless. But the situation he now faced was a complex, messy, and deeply personal shade of gray. He was faced with a profound and deeply troubling dilemma. He now knew the approximate location of his brother's camp. He had a federal posse of 20 hard, experienced men, all of them veterans of 100 such manhunts, all of them spoiling for a fight. The conventional, and legally sanctioned, course of action was clear. He should ride into those canyons in force, a hammer of the law, lay siege to the outlaw camp, and bring his brother and his gang to justice, dead or alive. It would be a bloody, brutal, and straightforward solution. But the woman's message had changed the equation. Hidden passages. She was offering him another way. A way of stealth, of subtlety, of the silent, surgical strike. A way that was not the way of the lawman, but the way of the outlaw. The way of his brother. To attack the camp directly would be to risk a massacre. The canyons of the Devil's Backbone were a natural fortress. Wyatt would be expecting a frontal assault. He would be prepared for it. He would have the high ground. He would have his pick of a dozen perfect ambush points. Men would die. Good men. And in the chaos, Wyatt, a master of just such terrain, might very well slip away, a ghost in the rocks, to continue his war on another day. But to use the hidden passages, to go in alone, or with a small, elite team, that was a different kind of gamble. It was a gamble that relied on the word of a known outlaw, a woman who was his brother's lover, a woman whose motives were as murky and as dangerous as the canyons she spoke of. Was she truly betraying Wyatt? Or was she, with a serpent's cunning, leading him into a different, and far more deadly trap? His dilemma was not just tactical, it was moral. To go in with his posse was to be the U.S. Marshal, the instrument of the official, sanctioned law, a clear, unambiguous force of order. To go in alone, a ghost in the rocks, was to become something else. It was to become a vigilante. It was to embrace the shadows. It was to become like his brother. He spent the day in a state of quiet, intense turmoil, his two natures at war with each other. The lawman, the man of the badge and the book, argued for the direct, open, and legally justifiable assault. But the hunter, the man of the frontier, the man who knew his brother's brilliant, twisted mind as well as he knew his own, argued for the more dangerous, more subtle, and ultimately more effective path. He sought the counsel of the one person in this town who seemed to exist outside the simple, brutal calculus of the gun, the one person who knew him, and his brother, better than anyone. He went to Maria, the hotel keeper. He found her in her small, beautiful, and peaceful garden behind the hotel, a small, fragile sanctuary of order and life in a town that had become an armed camp. She has turned on him, Maria said, her voice a quiet, certain statement of fact, after Jed had told her of the message. She did not seem surprised. Wyatt is a man who inspires great loyalty. He is a king, and his men are his disciples. But he is also a man who is, in the end, loyal only to himself, to his own grand vision. His obsession with me, his pride, he has broken their code. She sees it. She is a survivor, a pragmatist. She is cutting her losses. Can I trust her? Jed asked, the question a raw, vulnerable thing, the question of a man who was lost in a wilderness of his own making. Maria looked at him, her dark, deep eyes filled with a profound and deeply sad understanding. You can trust that she will do what is best for her, Jedediah. And right now, helping you may be what is best for her. She knows that Wyatt's new, mad course will lead them all to ruin. She is choosing the winning side, or what she believes will be the winning side. But do not mistake it for an act of conscience. It is an act of preservation. She is a serpent, Jed, and a serpent will always save its own skin first. Her words were a cold, clear dose of reality. He was not being offered an alliance with the side of angels. He was being offered a temporary, and very dangerous, truce with another devil. That night, Jed made his choice. He did not gather his posse in the saloon for a grand, heroic speech. He did not announce a dawn charge. He chose 3 of his best men, a silent Apache tracker whose people had been wronged by Wyatt's gang in the past, a grizzled ex-ranger with eyes that had seen it all, and the young, newly forged Sheriff Brody, who had earned his place in this elite, deadly company. We ride at midnight, he said to them, in the quiet, lamplit confines of his office, his voice a low, grim whisper. We are not a posse. We are a ghost patrol. We are not going in to fight a war. We are going in to cut the head off the snake. He was choosing to walk the line, to step into the gray, shadowy world between the law and the outlaw. He was choosing to fight his brother not just with the power of his badge, but with the cunning of a hunter. The lawman's dilemma had been solved. But Jedediah Kane knew, with a cold, chilling certainty, that in making this choice, in choosing to enter the devil's backbone through the serpent's secret door, he was in danger of becoming the very thing he was hunting. The devil's backbone was a place that lived up to its name. It was a jagged, skeletal ridge of rock and earth that rose from the flat, arid plains like the fossilized remains of some ancient, monstrous beast. It was a labyrinth of deep, twisting canyons, of high, sheer rock walls. A place where the sun baked the ground to the consistency of a kiln-fired brick, and the wind whispered through the narrow passages like the moan of a damned soul. It was a perfect place for a devil's lair. Jed and his 3 men, the Apache tracker known only as Chaco, the grizzled ex-ranger named Gus, and the wide-eyed but determined Sheriff Brody approached the canyons not as a posse, but as spirits. They rode through the night, their horses' hooves wrapped in thick, burlap cloth to muffle their sound, their movements a silent, coordinated dance of stealth and purpose. Chaco was their guide into this treacherous, alien world. He was a man who spoke little, but who read the language of the land as other men read a book. He led them not to the main, obvious entrance to the canyon network, a place that would be heavily guarded, but to a small, almost invisible fissure in the rock face. A place that was more a crack than a passage, a place that Maria, the serpent, had described to Brody with a perfect, deadly accuracy. She spoke the truth, Chaco whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves as he dismounted and examined the ground. This is the way of the coyote, not the way of the wolf. They left their horses in a small, hidden box canyon and entered the labyrinth on foot, a small, ghost-like intrusion into Wyatt Kane's private kingdom. The canyons were a maze, a disorienting, claustrophobic world of twisting passages and high, oppressive rock walls that seemed to lean in, to steal the very air from a man's lungs. But Chaco moved through them with an unerring, instinctive confidence, his hand occasionally touching a rock, a plant, a silent communion with the spirit of the place. They moved for hours, a slow, painstaking, and nerve-shredding infiltration. They could hear the sounds of Wyatt's camp now, the distant, faint echo of a man's laugh, the nicker of a horse, the soft, mournful tune of a harmonica. They were in the heart of the enemy's territory. They found their position on a high, sheltered ledge that overlooked the main outlaw camp. It was a perfect sniper's nest, a natural fortress that offered a commanding view of the entire scene below, while they themselves were cloaked in the deep, impenetrable shadows of an overhanging rock formation. The camp was a picture of a slow, simmering disintegration. The easy, confident camaraderie of Wyatt's gang was gone. The men were gathered in small, sullen, separate groups, their conversations a low, angry buzz. The disastrous train robbery, the whispers of Wyatt's personal obsession, the betrayal of the truce, the new, mad plan to attack a fortified town, it had all taken its toll. The pack was beginning to turn on itself. They saw Wyatt, a solitary, brooding figure, standing a little apart from his men, staring into the flames of the central fire. He was a king whose kingdom was beginning to crumble. And they saw Muriel, La Serpiente, watching him, her face a mask of cold, calculating appraisal. She was a woman who was waiting for the perfect moment to strike, to make her own final move. Jed looked at his men, their faces grim and determined in the faint, reflected firelight. "We wait for dawn," he whispered, his voice a low, hard growl. "At first light, when they are at their weakest, they're most vulnerable, when the sentries are tired and the camp is asleep, we cut the head off the snake. I will take Wyatt. Gus, you will take the big one, the one they call Silas. Chaco, you will take out their sentries, silently. Brody, your job is the woman." Brody looked at him, a question in his eyes. The woman was their informant, their ally, however treacherous. "She is a snake," Jed said, his voice as cold and as hard as a gravestone. "She helped us to save her own skin. But she is a part of this. She is as guilty as any of them. There will be no half measures. No one walks away from this. The law is the law, and it applies to everyone." It was a hard, brutal, and unbending statement. It was the creed of Jedediah Kane. He had stepped into the shadows to fight this battle, but he had not abandoned his own rigid and unforgiving code. As the long, tense hours of the night crawled by, a new, unexpected complication arose. A lone rider approached the camp. It was not one of Wyatt's men. It was a stranger, a man who rode with a desperate, frantic urgency. He was brought before Wyatt, and even from their distant perch, Jed could see that the man was a messenger. He watched as the man spoke, as Wyatt's posture, which had been one of brooding distraction, suddenly became one of sharp, alert, and then furious attention. He saw Wyatt grab the man by the collar, saw him shout, saw him throw the man to the ground in a fit of pure, uncontrolled rage. Something had changed. The entire emotional temperature of the camp had just shifted, from a low, sullen simmer to a hot, boiling rage. Jed did not know what the message was, but he knew, with a hunter's deep, unerring instinct, that his carefully laid plan, his clean, surgical strike at dawn, had just been shattered. The game had changed. The snake had been warned, and the dawn, which had promised a quiet, deadly resolution, now promised a long, bloody, and very uncertain battle. The message that had so enraged Wyatt Kane was a simple and devastating one. The messenger was a paid informant from a town 100 miles to the south, a man who had been trailing the federal marshals who were tracking the serial numbers of the stolen greenbacks. The message was that the $500,000, the prize of their great train robbery, the very foundation of Wyatt's dream of an empire, was now worthless. The U.S. government, in a swift and unprecedented move, spurred on by the sheer scale and audacity of the robbery, had issued a recall on the entire series of banknotes. New bills, with a different design and different serial numbers, were already being printed. The stolen money was now just a pile of beautifully engraved, but ultimately useless, paper. The news was a catastrophic blow. It was not just a financial loss, it was a profound and very public humiliation. Wyatt Kane, the great strategist, the man who had outsmarted the U.S. Army and his own legendary brother, had just been outmaneuvered by a group of faceless, anonymous bureaucrats in a far-off office in Washington, D.C. He was a king with a treasury full of fool's gold. His men, who had been on the verge of mutiny over matters of pride and personal loyalty, now had a far more tangible and more explosive reason to rebel. They had risked their lives, had become the most wanted men in the territory, for nothing. Wyatt Kane, a master of turning a crisis into an opportunity, reacted with a desperate and brilliant stroke of genius. He did not try to hide the news. He embraced it. He gathered his men, his face a mask of righteous, betrayed fury, the messenger's crumpled note in his hand. "We have been cheated," he roared, his voice ringing with a conviction that was so powerful it was almost believable. "The government, the bankers, the fat, cigar-smoking politicians in Washington, they have stolen our prize. They have made a mockery of our work. They have turned our victory into a joke." He then laid out his new, insane, and utterly captivating plan. They would not run. They would not hide. They would get their money. They would ride back to Redemption, the town that was his brother's new stronghold, the town that had become the symbol of everything they were fighting against. And they would take the town itself hostage. They would hold every man, woman, and child, and they would demand a new ransom, a ransom of $1 million in solid, and traceable, and very real gold, to be delivered by the very railroad they had so spectacularly robbed. It was a plan born of pure, audacious desperation. But it was a plan that spoke to the very soul of his men. It was not just about money anymore. It was about pride. It was about revenge. It was about spitting in the eye of a system that had, they now believed, cheated them. It was about making the world pay for their humiliation. His crumbling army, which moments before had been on the verge of collapse, was now reforged in the fire of this new, mad purpose. They were no longer just outlaws. They were insurgents, revolutionaries, men with nothing left to lose and a world to gain. From his perch on the high ledge, Jedediah Kane watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of horror. He did not know the content of the message, but he saw its effect. He saw his brother, a master manipulator, a veritable devil of persuasion, turn his beaten, demoralized gang into a single, cohesive, and now highly motivated army. He saw them checking their guns, saddling their horses, their faces no longer sullen, but filled with a new, wild, and terrifying fire. They were no longer a stationary target. They were a cavalry, a horde, about to ride to war, with his town, and the woman he loved, as their target. Jed's own plan was now in ruins. He could not take them all on. Not now, not with his small team of 4. He had to warn the town. He had to get back to Redemption. He made a quick, hard choice. "We're pulling out," he whispered to his men, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Now. We have to beat them back to Redemption. We have to give the town a fighting chance." But as they began their stealthy, desperate retreat, a new, terrible complication arose. Maria, La Serpiente, had not been swayed by Wyatt's charismatic, and ultimately insane, speech. She was a pragmatist. She knew that this new plan was not a stroke of genius. It was a suicide mission, and she had no intention of being a part of it. She had her own plan. She was going to take what she could and disappear. And what she could take was Wyatt's personal saddlebags, which she knew contained a small, but significant, stash of gold coins, the real, and tainted profits from their earlier, smaller raids. A treasure that Wyatt kept for his own, personal emergencies. Under the cover of the gang's new, furious preparations for war, she slipped into Wyatt's tent. She found the saddlebags. She had them in her hand. But Wyatt, for all his grand, public pronouncements, was no fool. He had been watching her. He knew her soul as well as he knew his own. He had anticipated her betrayal. He stepped into the tent behind her, a silent, deadly shadow. "Going somewhere, my love?" he asked, his voice a soft, silken, and utterly terrifying whisper. The confrontation that followed was not a loud, angry one. It was a quiet, intimate, and brutal dance of two predators who knew each other's every move, who had loved and lied to each other in equal measure. It was a fight of knives and whispers, of promises and betrayals. And it ended with Maria, the serpent, lying still and silent on the floor of the tent, her own final betrayal having been met with a swifter, more absolute, and more tragic one. Jed and his men, making their way through the treacherous, moonlit canyons, heard the single, muffled gunshot from the camp behind them. They did not know what it meant, but they knew that the brothers' gambit had just taken a new, and even more personal, and even more deadly turn. The war for money was over. The war of blood, and of brothers, was about to begin. The single, muffled gunshot from the outlaw camp was a final, punctuating mark on the end of Jedediah Kane's stealth mission. It was a sound that spoke of a final, internal betrayal, a severing of the last, frayed threads of the outlaw code. The time for ghosts and whispers was over. Now, there was only the desperate, brutal urgency of a race. A race against time. A race against his own brother, who had just been transformed from a cunning, if cornered, predator into a rabid, wounded, and utterly unpredictable animal. They ride for redemption, Jed said, his voice a low, grim statement of fact as they urged their horses through the treacherous, moonlit canyons, the sound of the unseen, chaotic preparations of the outlaw gang a faint, fading echo behind them. He has nothing left to lose now. He will make the town his fortress, and its people his shield. He will burn it to the ground just to watch it burn. The journey back was a hard, relentless, 24-hour ride through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the territory. They pushed themselves and their horses to the brink of exhaustion, their faces a grim, dust-caked mask of determination. There was no talk, no rest. There was only the steady, punishing rhythm of the horses' hooves, a drumbeat that counted down the precious hours they had left to save the town. They arrived at the outskirts of redemption at dawn, their horses lathered and trembling, to find their worst fears realized. The town was an armed camp. Wyatt and his gang, who had ridden with the speed of men possessed by a new, mad purpose, had arrived during the night, and their takeover had been swift, silent, and absolute. Sentries were posted on the roofs of the saloon and the general store, their rifles glinting in the first, clean light of the morning. The main street was barricaded at both ends with overturned wagons and barrels. The townspeople were prisoners in their own homes, their doors and windows shuttered, a profound, terrified silence hanging over the town. Redemption was now the personal, private kingdom of Wyatt Kane. Jed and his 3 men took up a position in a rocky outcrop that overlooked the town, a small, outnumbered, and seemingly hopeless island of law in a sea of outlawry. "What do we do now, Marshal?" Gus, the ex-ranger, asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, his eyes scanning the fortified town with a professional's grim appraisal. "We're 4 men against 15, and they hold the high ground, the hostages, and all the cards." Jed did not answer immediately. He was studying the town through his spyglass, his mind a cold, calculating machine, assessing the new, terrible geometry of the battlefield. He was not looking for weaknesses in Wyatt's defenses. He knew his brother. The defenses would be perfect. He was looking for strengths. His own. He saw that Wyatt, in his arrogance, in his belief that he had outrun his brother, had made a classic, and potentially fatal, mistake. He had fortified the town against an attack from the outside, from the main trails. But he had not considered an attack from within. The town of Redemption was not just a collection of buildings, it was a community that now had a leader. "He has the town," Jed said, his voice a low, steady whisper. "But we have the truth. And we have the people." His plan was a desperate, almost insane one. He would not lay siege to the town. He would not charge the barricades. He would infiltrate it. He would become a ghost again, a whisper of rebellion in the heart of his brother's new, short-lived empire. He turned to his men, his eyes holding a new, hard fire. "Chaco," he said to the Apache tracker, "you are the wind. You will move along the ridges. You will be our eyes. I want you to learn the patterns of his sentries. I want you to find the blind spots, the moments of inattention. You will be the ghost on the outside. Gus," he continued, "you are the thunder. When the time comes, I will need a storm, a diversion, a big one, something to draw their eyes, their guns, away from the real fight. And you, Brody," he said, looking at the young sheriff, whose face was a pale, but determined, mask of resolve. "You are the heart. The people in that town trust you. You know them. You know their homes, their secrets, the hidden ways between the buildings. You will be my voice, my messenger." His own role was the most dangerous of all. He would be the blade, the ghost on the inside. That night, under the cover of a moonless, starless sky, the infiltration began. Chaco moved with a supernatural silence, a phantom on the ridges, his dark eyes memorizing every detail of the occupied town, the placement of the sentries, the rhythm of their patrols. And Jed and Brody, their faces darkened with soot, their bodies wrapped in dark cloth, slipped into the town, not through the barricaded main street, but through a small, forgotten drainage culvert that ran beneath the general store, an old, half-forgotten piece of the town's history that Brody had remembered from his childhood. They were inside. 2 men, a ghost and a boy, a legend and his protege in the heart of a town that was held in the iron grip of a small, private army. Their first stop was the hotel of Maria. Jed had to know. He had to see. He moved through the back alleys with a lover's desperate, stealthy purpose. He found her room, dark and silent. He picked the lock, a skill he had learned in a long, misspent youth, a skill he had not used in 20 years. The room was empty. Her things were gone. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished. But there was a single small and damning piece of evidence left on her bedside table, a thing that was so out of place, so deliberately placed, that it could only be a message. It was a single, black-fletched arrow, of a kind he had never seen before. It was not a Comanche arrow. It was not a cavalry arrow. It was resting on a playing card. The Queen of Spades. A cold, terrible realization began to dawn on Jed. The woman who had betrayed his brother, the woman he had intended to bring to justice himself, she was not just a player in this game. She was the dealer of a whole new, and very deadly, hand. And she was holding all the cards. The race to redemption was over. The battle for its soul, and for the soul of the Kane brothers, had just entered a new, and far more complex, and far more treacherous stage. The occupied town of Redemption was a place of tense, suffocating quiet. Wyatt Kane ruled from the saloon, a self-styled king on a throne of stolen whiskey barrels, his remaining men a pack of nervous, edgy wolves who patrolled the streets with a lazy, arrogant confidence that did not quite hide the fear in their eyes. The townspeople were prisoners in their own homes, their initial, terrified shock now a slow, simmering cauldron of resentment and a desperate, fragile hope. That hope had a name: Jedediah Kane. In the shadows of this new, brutal order, a rebellion was being born. Jedediah and Sheriff Brody had become ghosts in the machine, a silent, invisible insurgency that was beginning to move through the hidden byways of the town, the back alleys, the rooftops, the secret passages between the buildings that only a lifetime of living there could teach. Their base of operations was the root cellar of the blacksmith shop, a dark, damp, and perfectly hidden sanctuary. And their army was a single, and very unlikely, individual, a woman who was now a prisoner in her own home, but whose spirit was as free and as defiant as ever. Maria, the hotel keeper. Jed had found her. He had reached her through an old, forgotten servants' passage that connected the hotel's kitchen to the alley behind it. Their reunion was not one of lovers, or of old, forgotten friends. It was one of allies, 2 people bound together by a shared, and very dangerous, enemy. She became his eyes and ears inside the occupation. She was a woman of immense courage and a subtle, formidable intelligence. She moved through her hotel, serving the outlaws who had taken it over, her face a mask of quiet, subservient compliance. But she was listening. She was watching. She learned their names, their weaknesses, their vices, the growing fractures in their loyalty to Wyatt. And she fed this information to Jed, in a series of coded messages passed in a loaf of bread and a bundle of laundry. And Jed, with this intelligence, began his war. It was not a war of open battle. It was a war of 1,000, small, surgical cuts. A war of attrition. A war of the mind. One night, the sentry on the roof of the general store was found at his post, his throat cut, a silent, professional kill that left no clues. The next night, the outlaw's entire stash of spare ammunition, which had been stored in the livery stable, was soaked in coal oil and set ablaze, the fire a brilliant, defiant beacon in the night that was extinguished before it could spread, but not before its message had been delivered. Wyatt Kane was a man fighting a ghost who knew his every move, who seemed to be inside his own head. His men were growing more terrified, more paranoid. They were seeing shadows in every corner, hearing whispers in the wind. They were beginning to desert, 2 of them slipping away in the dead of night. Their fear of Wyatt's increasingly erratic and violent wrath now less than their fear of the invisible, omnipresent phantom that was hunting them. The ghost in the machine was Jed, but the heart of the rebellion was Brody. The young sheriff, who had once been a figure of timid inadequacy, was now a symbol of hope, a whisper of defiance that moved through the town at night. He visited the homes of the town's key figures, the blacksmith, the store owner, the doctor. He was organizing them. He was arming them with the guns from his own locked evidence room. He was turning a town of victims into an army in waiting. The final piece of the puzzle was the woman who was not there. Maria, La Serpiente, the black-fletched arrow, the queen of spades. Jed had not forgotten. He had shown the arrow to Chaco, who had examined it with a grim, knowing eye. "It is not from any tribe I know," the tracker had said. "It is from the south, from the lands of the Yaqui. It is the mark of a woman, a warrior woman they call La Cazadora, the huntress." The name meant nothing to Jed, but it was another piece of the complex, deadly puzzle he was now a part of. The woman who had betrayed his brother had not just disappeared. She had an army of her own, and she was waiting. The breaking point came on the 5th day of the occupation. Wyatt Kane, his army dwindling, his mind frayed by the constant, invisible pressure of his brother's ghost war, his paranoia now a raging, all-consuming fire, made his final, desperate move. He announced that at high noon, he would begin to execute the townspeople, one by one, starting with their beloved hotel keeper, Maria, until his brother, the great, heroic Marshal Jedediah Kane, the ghost who had been tormenting him, came out to face him in the middle of the main street. It was the challenge he had been wanting all along. A final, public, and very personal duel. A showdown between the two brothers, for the soul of the town, and for the soul of the woman they both loved. The ghost in the machine had been called out. The time for shadows was over. The time for the final, bloody, and very public reckoning was at hand. High noon in Redemption was a moment of absolute, suspended silence. The sun beat down from a white-hot, merciless sky, bleaching the color from the dusty main street, which was empty, a stage set for a final, tragic act. At one end of the street stood Wyatt Kane, his fine, tailored suit now dusty and rumpled, his handsome face a pale, sweat-slicked mask of hate, his hand hovering over the butt of his silver-inlaid Remington. At the other end stood U.S. Marshal Jedediah Kane, a tall, implacable figure of the law, his duster pushed back to reveal the twin, worn, and very practical Colts that were the tools of his trade. Between them, in the center of the street, stood Maria. She was not a weeping, terrified victim. She stood with a proud, defiant, and almost regal calm, her hands unbound, a beautiful, tragic, and very much unwilling prize in this final, deadly game. This was not just a gunfight. It was a trial, a public weighing of two souls, of two philosophies, of two brothers. It always had to end this way, didn't it, Jedediah? Wyatt called out, his voice a raw, ragged sound that carried in the still, hot air. Just you and me. The way it should have been from the start. No armies, no ghosts. Just the two of us. It didn't have to be this way, Wyatt, Jed replied, his own voice a low, sad rumble, a sound of profound and deeply personal grief. You made your choices. You chose this path. I made the only choices a man can make in this world, Wyatt spat, his voice rising with a passionate, self-justifying fury. I chose to be a wolf, not a sheep. I chose to take, not to be taken from. It is you who is the fool, brother. You, with your laws, your honor, your tin star. What has it ever gotten you? A lonely life, and a lonely grave. He was not just talking to Jed. He was talking to the world, to the hidden, watching eyes of the townspeople who were peering from behind their shuttered windows, to the ghost of his own, bitter and resentful past. From the rooftops, from the windows, from the alleys, the two opposing armies watched. Wyatt's remaining handful of thugs, their faces grim, their loyalty now a thing of pure, animal fear. And the townspeople of Redemption, armed and ready, their new sheriff, Brody, at their head, a silent, grim-faced jury. And in the high country, two other, silent figures watched through their spyglasses. Chaco, the tracker, and Gus, the ranger. They were Jed's insurance. Let her go, Wyatt, Jed said, his voice a final, weary plea. This is between us. Let her walk away. Wyatt laughed, a harsh, broken sound that held no humor, only a deep, profound, and all-consuming pain. She is between us. She has always been between us. She is the prize. To the victor go the spoils. He drew his pistol. He was fast, A blur of motion, a striking snake of silver and death. But Jed was faster. He had always been faster. He was not a man of style, of flash. He was a man of pure, simple, and deadly efficiency. Their two guns roared at the same instant, a single, deafening thunderclap that was the final, bloody exclamation point on their long, bitter, and tragic war. Wyatt stood frozen for a single, stunned heartbeat, a look of profound, final surprise on his face, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He looked at his brother, not with hatred, but with a kind of sad, final understanding. "I win," he whispered, a final, cryptic, and ultimately empty declaration, and then he crumpled to the ground, his own personal, and very empty, victory finally achieved. Jed stood, his own gun smoking, a dark, spreading stain on his own side. Wyatt's final, dying shot had been true. As the smoke cleared, and the echoes of the gunshots faded, a new, and final, player entered the stage. From the alley beside the saloon, a woman emerged. It was not Maria, the hotel keeper. It was Maria, La Serpiente, and she was not alone. Behind her were a half-dozen, hard-faced, Yaqui warriors, their bows drawn, their arrows tipped with a dark, glistening poison. And at her side was another woman, a tall, beautiful, and utterly terrifying figure, with the eyes of a hawk and the bearing of a queen. La Cazadora, the huntress. They had not been fighting a war of two sides. They had been fighting a war of three. And the third, and most patient, of the predators had just arrived to claim the spoils. The outlaws were dead. The lawman was wounded. The town was in chaos. And in the middle of it all stood the two women, the two serpents, and their army. They had not come for the brothers. They had not come for the town. They had come for the gold. And the only thing that now stood in their way was a single, wounded lawman, and a town that had just, in a final, bloody, and very unexpected twist, found its own, very stubborn, and very angry soul. The story of the brothers Kane was over, but the story of redemption, and its final, desperate stand, had just begun.